The gavel was inches from striking the mahogany, a sound that would have stripped Catherine Sterling of everything she owned. Her husband, billionaire tech mogul Alexander Sterling, sat with a smirk that could cut glass, convinced his high-priced legal team had just secured the victory of the decade. The world saw Catherine as the ultimate gold digger, about to be discarded. But as Judge Harrison raised his hand to finalize the judgment, Catherine didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply reached into her purse and pulled out a single, yellowed envelope that hadn't seen the light of day in 10 years. What was inside wouldn't just change the verdict, it would destroy Alexander's empire. The silence inside the town car was heavier than the humid New York air outside. Alexander Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, and the man recently dubbed the Architect of Tomorrow by Forbes, adjusted his cufflinks. They were platinum, inlaid with onyx, a gift from the Prime Minister of Japan. He didn't look at the woman sitting next to him. He was busy scrolling through stock futures on a prototype tablet his company hadn't even released yet. Catherine Sterling sat on the other side of the leather bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To the paparazzi camped outside the Manhattan Supreme Court, she was the porcelain doll, beautiful, silent, and fragile. The narrative had been spun expertly by Alexander's PR team for months. Catherine was the small-town waitress who had snagged a whale, lived the high life for a decade, and was now being cut loose because she couldn't keep up with Alexander's visionary lifestyle. "Do try to look somewhat remorseful today, Catherine," Alexander said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. He finally glanced up from his screen, his icy blue eyes assessing her like she was a depreciating asset. "Gavin says, if you cry when we leave, the press might turn on you. Just keep that stoic, confused look you've perfected. It plays better for the settlement optics." Catherine turned her head slowly. She wore a simple navy dress, conservative and understated. No jewelry, not even her wedding ring. "Is that what Gavin says?" she asked softly. "Gavin is the best divorce attorney in the state," Alexander replied, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "He's never lost, and he's not about to start with a case as open and shut as this. You signed the prenuptial agreement 11 years ago, Catherine. You get the flat payout, the condo in Connecticut, and you walk away. Don't make this difficult." Alexander believed in contracts. He believed in leverage. He believed that human relationships were transactional, just like the code he wrote. He had met Catherine Moore in a diner in Ohio when his first startup was floundering. She had been the only bright spot in a miserable year, but that was a lifetime ago. Now, she was just an anchor dragging him down. He needed a power couple partner, someone like the heiress of the radical biotech firm he was looking to acquire. Catherine was yesterday's news. The car slowed to a halt. The flashbulbs erupted like lightning storms against the tinted windows. "Showtime," Alexander muttered. He opened the door, instantly transforming into the charismatic, aggrieved billionaire. He waved briefly, a look of pained resignation on his face, as if divorcing his wife was the hardest decision he'd ever made. Catherine stepped out behind him. The wall of noise hit her instantly. "Catherine, is it true you cheated? Alexander? Are you keeping the Hampton estate? Catherine, how much are you asking for?" She kept her head down, clutching her leather purse tightly against her side. Inside that purse was not a tissue for her tears, nor a compact for her makeup. It was a document she had retrieved from a safety deposit box in Zurich 3 days ago, a document Alexander had forgotten about. Or perhaps, in his arrogance, he assumed she had been too stupid to keep. They entered the courthouse, the heavy doors shutting out the chaos. Alexander strode ahead, flanked by Gavin Reed, a lawyer whose suit cost more than most people's cars. Gavin was a shark in human skin, known for destroying spouses on the stand until they settled for pennies, just to make the pain stop. "Mrs. Sterling," Gavin said, offering a curt nod as they waited for the elevator. "I hope you're ready to finalize this today. The judge is Thomas Harrison. He's a stickler for time. He hates lengthy proceedings." "I'm aware of Judge Harrison's reputation," Catherine said. Her voice was steady, clearer than it had been in the car. Alexander laughed, a short, sharp bark. She's been reading legal blogs, Gavin. Watch out. Gavin smirked. It's standard procedure, Alexander. We go in, we present the original prenup, citing the cap on alimony based on the 10-year clause, and we're done by lunch. I have a tea time at 2. They stepped into the elevator. The metal doors closed, trapping the three of them in a box of polished steel. Catherine looked at her reflection. She didn't look like a porcelain doll anymore. In the reflection, she looked like a hunter, waiting in the tall grass. Alexander checked his watch. Make sure you mention the charity work, he told Gavin. I want to look generous. Of course, Gavin replied. We're painting you as the benevolent provider who outgrew a partner who refused to evolve. It's a classic narrative. The public eats it up. Catherine stayed silent. They thought she was weak. They thought she was the waitress from Ohio who got lucky. They had forgotten that before she was a waitress, she was something else entirely. They had forgotten that silence didn't always mean submission. Sometimes it meant you were just loading the gun. Courtroom 4B was cold, sterile, and smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Judge Thomas Harrison sat on the bench, a man with graying hair and a face carved from granite. He was known as the Butcher of Broadway among divorce lawyers because he cut through nonsense with brutal efficiency. He didn't care about tears. He cared about the law. Alexander sat at the plaintiff's table, looking every inch the master of the universe. Gavin Reed was arranging his files with military precision. On the other side, Catherine sat alone. She had fired her legal team 2 days prior. Mrs. Sterling, Judge Harrison boomed, looking over his spectacles. I see you are without counsel. Do you understand the risks of representing yourself in a high-stakes divorce proceeding involving assets totaling in the billions? I do, Your Honor. Catherine stood up. Her posture was perfect. I don't require a lawyer for what I need to say. Gavin Reed leaned over to Alexander and whispered, She's going for the sympathy play. Look at me, the poor abandoned wife against the big bad legal team. It won't work with Harrison. Alexander nodded, suppressing a smile. Just crush her, Gavin. Mr. Reed, you may proceed, the judge ordered. Gavin Reed stood up, buttoning his jacket. He walked to the center of the room, commanding the space. He didn't look at Catherine. He looked at the judge. Your Honor, we are here to enforce a prenuptial agreement signed by both parties 11 years ago on August 14th, 2014. The terms are explicit. In the event of a dissolution of marriage, Mrs. Sterling is entitled to a lump sum of $2 million plus the deed to the couple's secondary residence in Connecticut. She waives all rights to Sterling Dynamics stock, future earnings, and intellectual property. Gavin paced back and forth, his voice rising theatrically. My client, Mr. Sterling, has been more than generous. He has supported Mrs. Sterling for a decade. He has paid for her lifestyle, her travels, her hobbies, but the marriage has irretrievably broken down due to irreconcilable differences regarding ambition and lifestyle contribution. Mr. Sterling built an empire. Mrs. Sterling simply lived in it. He turned to look at Catherine, his eyes mocking. We have the original document here, Your Honor, notarized and signed. There is no ambiguity. We ask for a summary judgment to enforce the prenup and dissolve the marriage immediately. Gavin handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Harrison flipped through the pages, nodding slowly. It seems to be in order, the judge grumbled. He looked at Catherine. Mrs. Sterling, do you contest the validity of this signature? Catherine stood up again. No, Your Honor. That is my signature. I signed that prenuptial agreement in 2014. A ripple of confusion went through the few reporters allowed in the back of the room. If she wasn't contesting the signature, what was she doing? Alexander let out a long breath. It was over. She was folding. However, Catherine continued, her voice gaining a harder edge, that agreement was signed under the premise of the financial situation at that time. Financial situations change, Mrs. Sterling, Judge Harrison said, sounding bored. That is the point of a prenup, to protect future assets. Correct, Catherine said. But Mr. Reed failed to mention the addendum. The contract he is presenting is incomplete. Gavin Reed frowned. Objection. There is no addendum. I drafted that prenup myself. It is a standalone document. You drafted the first one? Yes, Catherine said, finally turning to look at Gavin. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent. But you weren't there on the night of November 12th, 2016, were you, Gavin? Alexander froze. His hand, resting on the table, twitched. November 12th, 2016. The date hit him like a physical blow. He remembered that night. It was the night Sterling Dynamics almost died. The night the servers crashed, the funding was pulled, and the SEC was knocking on the door. It was the darkest night of his life. Your Honor, Catherine said, walking around her table. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She moved with the predatory grace of a corporate raider. Mr. Sterling is trying to divorce me based on the 2014 agreement, but he seems to have forgotten that in 2016, when his company was 24 hours away from bankruptcy and he was facing federal indictment for fraud, he came to me for help. Objection! Relevancy! Gavin shouted, sensing a shift in the room's energy. This is ancient history and hearsay. It's not hearsay if it's in writing, Catherine said calmly. Alexander's face went pale. He leaned forward, his whisper harsh. What are you doing, Cat? Catherine ignored him. She reached into her bag. The sound of the zipper opening seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. She pulled out the yellowed envelope. Your Honor, she said, holding the document up, this is a post-nuptial solvency agreement. It was drafted by Alexander Sterling himself, handwritten because he couldn't trust his lawyers to know how close he was to prison. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. Order! Mrs. Sterling, bring that document to the bench. Now. Gavin Reed looked at Alexander. What is she talking about? What solvency agreement? Alexander was staring at the envelope, sweat beading on his forehead. I thought she burned it. She said she would burn it if we got through the crisis. You idiot, Gavin hissed. Catherine walked to the bench and handed the document to the judge. She turned back to face her husband. For the first time all morning, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had been underestimated for 10 years and was finally done pretending. Mr. Reed, Catherine said, her voice projecting to the back of the room, you claimed I simply lived in Alexander's empire. But you're wrong. I bought his empire, and I have the receipt. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, reading the handwritten text on the yellowed paper. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He looked from the paper to Alexander, then back to the paper. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, his voice dangerously low. Is this your handwriting? Alexander stood up, his legs shaking slightly. Your Honor, I was under duress. I was emotional. That document was never meant to be legal binding. It was a promise between spouses. It has a notary stamp, the judge pointed out. From a notary in the Cayman Islands? We were on vacation, Catherine interjected smoothly. Trying to escape the heat of the investigation, Alexander needed liquid cash to cover the margin calls. I gave it to him, $50 million, from my grandmother's trust money. He swore I didn't have money he never knew about until he was desperate. And in exchange? The judge asked, reading the bottom of the page. In exchange, Catherine said, locking eyes with Alexander, I didn't ask for interest. I didn't ask for shares. I asked for a clause, the betrayal clause. If Alexander ever filed for divorce, or if he was found to be unfaithful, the ownership of the Sterling algorithm, the core code that runs his entire company, reverts to me. The silence that followed was absolute. The Sterling algorithm was worth hundreds of billions. It was the brain behind the self-driving cars, the logistics networks, the military defense grids. That's impossible, Gavin Reed whispered, his face draining of color. That makes her. It makes her the owner of Sterling Dynamics, Alexander whispered, sinking back into his chair. Catherine stood tall. I tried to be the good wife, Xander. I tried to let you be the big man. But you got greedy. You wanted to trade me in. Now, I'm calling in the debt. The atmosphere in courtroom 4B had shifted from a sterile legal proceeding to something resembling a gladiatorial arena. The air conditioning hummed, but the room felt suffocatingly hot. Judge Harrison held the yellowed document, the post-nuptial solvency agreement, under the harsh light of his desk lamp, his eyes scanning every loop of the handwriting. Gavin Reed, Alexander's lawyer, was no longer checking his watch for his tea time. He was sweating. A thin sheen of perspiration had broken out on his upper lip, ruining his perfectly applied bronzer. He leaned in close to Alexander, his whisper a venomous hiss. "You told me she was a simpleton, Alexander. You told me she didn't have a checking account until she met you. Where the hell did she get $50 million in 2016? Alexander Sterling, the man who stared down Senate subcommittees and hostile takeovers without blinking, looked like he was about to be sick. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table until his knuckles turned white. "It was a trust," he muttered, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and genuine fear. "Her grandmother. I thought it was a myth. A few $1,000s, maybe. Not this." "You signed it," Gavin hissed. "You actually signed away the IP rights to the algorithm?" "I had to," Alexander snapped, too loud. Heads turned in the gallery. He lowered his voice. "The SEC was in the lobby. The servers were dark. I needed liquidity within 4 hours, or Sterling Dynamics would have ceased to exist. She was there. She had the checkbook. She smiled and said she could help. Mr. Reed," Judge Harrison's voice cut through their panic like a knife. "I have reviewed the document. On the surface, it appears to be a valid contract, notarized, dated, and signed by both parties. Do you have a response before I enter this into the record?" Gavin Reed straightened his jacket. He was a shark, and sharks didn't stop swimming just because there was blood in the water. He walked toward the bench, his face composing itself into a mask of righteous indignation. "Your Honor, we absolutely contest the validity of this." "Scrap of paper," Gavin announced, gesturing dismissively at the document. "This is not a contract. It is an instrument of extortion." Catherine remained seated, her face impassive. She watched Gavin with the detached interest of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. "Extortion?" Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. "That is a serious charge, counselor. And a fitting one," Gavin continued, his voice rising. "Look at the date, Your Honor. November 12th, 2016. The blackout of 16. It is a matter of public record that Mr. Sterling was under immense psychological and financial pressure that week. He was sleep-deprived, arguably medicated, and facing the collapse of his life's work. Mrs. Sterling, if she indeed provided these funds, did not act as a partner. She acted as a predator." Gavin turned to face the gallery, playing to the reporters. She waited until he was on his knees, drowning, and she offered him a life raft, but only if he agreed to put a gun to his own head. This constitutes undue influence and extreme duress. No court in New York would uphold a contract signed when one party was effectively held hostage by their own bankruptcy. Judge Harrison looked at Catherine. "Mrs. Sterling, do you wish to respond to the allegation of duress?" Catherine stood up slowly. She didn't rush. Every movement was calculated. She walked to the center of the room, standing toe-to-toe with Gavin Reed. She was shorter than him, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over the entire legal team. "Duress," Catherine said, tasting the word. "Mr. Reed, you define duress as pressure. I define it as consequences. Alexander wasn't forced to sign. He had options." "What options?" Alexander shouted from the table, unable to help himself. "I had no options. No one would lend to me." Catherine turned to him, her eyes cold. "Exactly. No one would lend to you because they knew you were a risk. They knew the code was unstable. They knew you had over-leveraged the company on a gamble. The market had spoken, Alexander. You were finished. I offered you a restart. I offered you a second chance. And the price of that chance was insurance, that you wouldn't betray me the way you betrayed your original investors." She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, if a bank lends money to a desperate man at a high interest rate, is that duress? No. It's business. I didn't charge interest. I charged loyalty." And since Alexander has filed for divorce to run off with his 24-year-old CFO, he has defaulted on that loyalty. I am simply foreclosing on the collateral. The collateral is the entire company, Gavin roared. It is unconscionable. It's a penalty clause that is disproportionate to the loan. The loan was $50 million, Catherine shot back, her voice suddenly sharp, losing its soft edge. But the value of the save was the company itself. Without my money, Sterling Dynamics is zero. Nothing. Dust. So, owning the company is exactly proportionate to the value of the investment. We demand an evidentiary hearing. Gavin slammed his hand on the table. We demand to trace the source of these funds. A waitress from Ohio does not have $50 million sitting in a checking account. For all we know, this money was laundered. If the source of the funds is illicit, the contract is void. This was the Hail Mary. Gavin was betting that Catherine, the small-town girl, had a dirty secret. Maybe an old sugar daddy, maybe criminal ties. If he could paint the money as dirty, he could kill the deal. Judge Harrison frowned. He looked at the clock. This is highly irregular. However, given the stakes, the ownership of a Fortune 500 company, I am inclined to grant a short recess to allow the plaintiff to prepare arguments regarding the validity of the funds. But be warned, Mr. Reed, if this is a fishing expedition, I will sanction you. It's not fishing, Your Honor, Gavin said, smiling cruelly at Catherine. It's a fraud investigation. Court is in recess for 1 hour, Judge Harrison banged the gavel. As the room cleared, Alexander rushed up to Catherine in the aisle. His face was red, his eyes bulging. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. Let go of me, Catherine said calmly. Who are you? Alexander whispered, shaking her. I lived with you for 10 years. You knitted sweaters. You baked bread. You watched reality TV. Who the hell are you? I'm the woman who saved you, Catherine said, pulling her arm free. And I'm the woman you shouldn't have underestimated. You liked me because I was quiet, Xander. You thought quiet meant stupid. You never asked why I was quiet. I'm going to destroy you, Alexander spat. Gavin will tear your finances apart. We'll find where you stole that money, and when we do, you won't get the company. You'll go to prison. Catherine leaned in close, smelling the expensive cologne that failed to mask the scent of his fear. Dig, Alexander. Dig as deep as you want, but be careful. You might not like what you find buried in my garden. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving him standing there, terrified of the stranger he had married. The recess flew by in a blur of frantic phone calls. In the hallway, Gavin Reed was screaming at his team of paralegals back at the firm. Get me everything on Catherine Moore, not the PR puff pieces, the real data. Birth certificate, tax returns prior to 2014, known associates. I want to know who her grandmother was and why a waitress had an offshore trust fund. Alexander paced the marble corridor, his phone pressed to his ear. Sell the secondary shares, he barked at his broker. No, I don't care about the price drop. I need liquid cash in a Cayman account now, just in case she freezes the domestic assets. Do it. He hung up and looked at the closed doors of the courtroom. He felt a sickening sensation in his gut, the same feeling he had in 2016. He had always thought he was the smartest person in the room. He was the visionary. Catherine was just the ornament. The realization that the ornament might be made of reinforced steel was shattering his reality. When the bailiff opened the doors, the gallery was packed. Word had spread. The divorce of the century had turned into a corporate hostage situation. Judge Harrison resumed his seat. Mr. Reed, you requested this time to challenge the legitimacy of the funds used in the 2016 agreement. Proceed. Gavin stood up. He looked confident again. He held a tablet in his hand. Your Honor, we have run a preliminary background check on Catherine Moore. It appears that Catherine Moore does not exist. A gasp went through the room. Alexander looked at Gavin, confused. What? To be precise, Gavin continued, smirking. The woman sitting there has a birth certificate for Catherine Moore, born in Dayton, Ohio. But the social security number associated with that name belongs to a woman who died in 1998. This woman is a fraud. She is a ghost. Gavin turned to Catherine, pointing a finger like a weapon. She has no legal standing to enforce a contract because she signed it under a false identity. The money is undoubtedly proceeds from identity theft or wire fraud. Judge Harrison turned his gaze to Catherine. It was a heavy, accusing look. Mrs. Sterling, this is a severe accusation. Is your name Catherine Moore? Catherine stood up. She didn't look at Gavin. She looked at Alexander. My name is Catherine, she said clearly. But Moore was my mother's maiden name. I used it to distance myself from my father's legacy. And who was your father? Gavin sneered. A bank robber? My father was Silas Vane, Catherine said quietly. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Silas Vane. The name was legendary in the tech world, but for all the wrong reasons. Silas Vane was the original architect of the Vane Protocol, the foundational code for modern cryptography. He had been a genius, a recluse, and a paranoid schizophrenic who vanished in the late 90s after accusing the government of stealing his work. He was presumed dead. Alexander's mouth fell open. Silas. You're Silas Vane's daughter? Yes, Catherine said. And my grandmother, who left me the trust, was Eleanor Vane. The money didn't come from crime, Gavin. It came from the patents my father held before he disappeared. Patents that, interesting enough, bear a striking resemblance to the core code of Sterling Dynamics. Gavin froze. He had walked right into a landmine. You see, Your Honor, Catherine continued, addressing the judge. I didn't just have money. I had knowledge. I grew up reading code before I could read English. My father taught me everything. When I met Alexander, I wasn't a waitress because I was poor. I was a waitress because I was hiding. I wanted a simple life, away from the tech world that drove my father insane. She took a step toward Alexander. But then I met you. You were charming. You were full of big ideas. And you were struggling with a code architecture that wouldn't scale. Do you remember, Xander? Late nights in your garage? You were crying because the latency was too high. You couldn't fix it. Alexander backed away, his face pale. Stop it. Who fixed it, Xander? Catherine asked relentlessly. Who sat down at your computer while you were asleep and optimized the kernel? You said you just organized the files. Alexander stammered. I rewrote the base layer using the Vane protocol, Catherine said. I gave you the empire. I built the engine of Sterling Dynamics. I let you take the credit because I didn't want the fame. I wanted a husband. I wanted a family. She turned back to the judge, her voice breaking slightly, showing the first sign of genuine emotion. I trusted him with my life, Your Honor. I trusted him with my father's legacy. And when the company hit the wall in 2016, I used the last of my family's money, clean, taxed money, to save him. The solvency agreement wasn't extortion. It was me buying back my own creation. Gavin Reed looked like he had been punched in the gut. He looked at his client. Is this true? Did she write the code? She dabbled. Alexander lied. But his voice was weak. She helped with the UI. That's all. The UI? Catherine laughed. A cold, sharp sound. Your Honor, I propose a test. A test? Judge Harrison asked, intrigued. The Sterling algorithm is famous for being uncrackable, Catherine said. Alexander claims he wrote it. I claim I wrote the core. There is a backdoor key, a signature, hidden in the compiled hex code of the main server. It's a failsafe my father taught me to put in everything I build. She turned to Alexander. If you wrote it, Xander, tell the court the hex key. Tell them the password to the root directory. Alexander stared at her. Sweat dripped down his nose. He knew the marketing pitch. He knew the stock price. He knew the user interface. But the deep code, the root directory, he hadn't touched that in years. He had teams of engineers who managed the updates. But none of them dared touch the black box at the center, because Alexander had always claimed it was too complex for them to understand. The truth was, he didn't understand it either. He had just built on top of the miracle fix Catherine had left him that night in the garage. It's a complex alphanumeric sequence, Alexander stuttered. I don't have it memorized. It's in a safe. I have it memorized, Catherine said, because it's not a random sequence. It's a date and a name. She looked at the stenographer. Type this. 110419888 Kitty. Alexander's eyes widened. November 4th, 1988, Catherine's birthday. And Kitty, her childhood nickname. If the court appoints a technical expert to access the Sterling Dynamics mainframe and input that sequence, Catherine said, it will unlock the developer console and display the copyright notice. Property of C. Vane. The courtroom was silent. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was the unraveling of a fraud. Judge Harrison looked at Alexander Sterling. The billionaire looked small, shrunken in his expensive suit. Mr. Sterling, the judge said heavily, does Mrs. Sterling speak the truth? Alexander looked at Gavin. Gavin looked at the floor, distancing himself from the blast radius. It was a collaboration, Alexander whispered, his voice cracking. We were partners. And yet, Catherine said, you tried to leave your partner with nothing but a condo in Connecticut. I made you, Alexander suddenly screamed, snapping. You were nothing, a nobody. I built the company. I did the sales. I did the marketing. The code is nothing without the vision. You're just a coder. I am the architect. And the architect just forgot to pay his rent, Catherine said coldly. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. Enough. I have heard enough to make a preliminary ruling on the validity of the solvency agreement. Wait, Gavin shouted. Your Honor, even if she wrote the code, even if she paid the money, the company has grown 1,000-fold since 2016. Surely she isn't entitled to everything. The shareholders, the board. The contract is specific, the judge said, putting on his glasses. It says, ownership of the Sterling algorithm and all derivative assets. If the company is built on that algorithm, she owns the company. But there is one more thing, Alexander said, his eyes wild. A sinister calm washed over him. He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a pen, but for his phone. You think you've won, Cat, but you forgot who I deal with. You forgot about the defense contracts? Catherine stiffened. Sterling Dynamics runs the drone logistics for the Pentagon, Alexander said, a cruel smile returning to his face. Do you really think the United States government is going to let the daughter of Silas Vane, a known cyber anarchist, take control of their defense grid? He held up his phone. I just sent a text to my contact at the NSA. National Security Intervention, Catherine. They'll seize the company before they let you touch it. If I can't have it, he snarled, no one can. The doors to the courtroom burst open. But it wasn't the NSA. It was a man in a rumpled trench coat, holding a stack of files. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were bright with adrenaline. Objection, the man shouted from the back of the room. I have new evidence. Judge Harrison looked ready to explode. Who are you? This is a closed courtroom. I'm Detective Miller, NYPD Fraud Division, the man said, marching down the aisle. And I'm not here for the divorce. I'm here for the murder investigation. Catherine and Alexander both froze. Murder? Judge Harrison asked. The death of Silas Vane wasn't a disappearance, the detective said, dropping a file on the plaintiff's table. He looked directly at Alexander Sterling. We just found the car, and we found the tampering on the brake line. And guess whose signature is on the work order from the mechanic shop in 1999? The color drained from Alexander's face, so completely he looked like a corpse. You didn't just steal his code, Alexander, Catherine whispered, her hand covering her mouth. You. I didn't, Alexander shrieked. That's a lie. This is a setup. The air in courtroom 4B had turned poisonous. The silence that followed Detective Miller's accusation was not the silence of peace. It was the vacuum before an explosion. Murder, Alexander Sterling repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the detective, then at the judge, and finally at Catherine. This is insane. Silas Vane disappeared. Everyone knows that. He went off the grid. He was paranoid. He probably died in a cabin in Montana. We didn't find him in Montana, Detective Miller said, his voice gravelly and tired. He walked to the plaintiff's table and slammed a plastic evidence bag down on top of the prenup files. Inside was a rusted, corroded piece of metal. It looked like a bracket of some kind. "We found him 3 days ago," Miller continued, addressing the judge but keeping his eyes on Alexander, "dredging a quarry in upstate New York. A 1,998 Saab. 900. The driver was still inside, or what was left of him. Dental records confirmed it this morning. Silas Vane." Catherine let out a small, strangled sound. She covered her mouth with both hands. For 10 years, she had believed her father had abandoned her. She had believed the narrative Alexander had gently reinforced during their late-night talks, that Silas was a genius, but a broken man who couldn't handle the responsibility of a daughter, that he had run away to protect her from his own madness. "He didn't run," Catherine whispered, tears finally spilling over. "He was there the whole time?" At the bottom of the quarry, Miller nodded grimly. "And this," he pointed to the rusted metal, "is the brake caliper. The line was cut, clean, with a tool, and inside the glove box, preserved in a waterproof container, was a work order for a brake inspection dated 2 days prior, signed by a young mechanic named A. Sterling." Alexander backed away from the table, shaking his head violently. "I was an intern. I worked at the garage to pay for college. I didn't kill him. I might have worked on his car, but that proves nothing." "It proves opportunity," Miller said. "And we know the motive. The laptop." "What laptop?" Judge Harrison asked, leaning forward. "The laptop that was missing from the car," Miller said. "Silas Vane never went anywhere without his prototype machine. It contained the alpha build of the Vane protocol. The car was empty, but 6 months later, Alexander Sterling launched his first startup with a revolutionary new encryption method. "Circumstantial," Gavin Reed shrieked. He was trying to salvage the situation, but his eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit. "You can't prove he took it. You can't prove he cut the line. We can prove he was the last person to see him alive," Miller said. "And we can prove that 3 days after the disappearance, Alexander paid off his student loans in cash." "It was an inheritance," Alexander yelled. "From who?" Catherine asked softly. Her voice cut through the shouting. She stood up, her grief hardening instantly into cold, diamond-hard rage. "You told me your parents died broke. You told me you built everything from scratch. You stole it. You stole my father's life, and then you stole his work." "I improved it," Alexander screamed, cracking under the pressure. The veneer of the billionaire CEO shattered, revealing the desperate, greedy boy underneath. He was going to open source it. He was going to give it away to the world for free. He was a lunatic. He didn't understand the value of what he had. "I saved the code. I gave it purpose." "You gave it a price tag," Catherine said. Alexander was panting, his tie askew. He looked at the heavy oak doors of the courtroom. "It doesn't matter," he sneered, a manic glint in his eye. "You can't arrest me. Not yet. You have a rusty car and a theory. But I have the United States government." He held up his phone again. "My contact is here. You think the NSA wants a murder investigation to disrupt their logistics network? You think they want the Vane protocol in the hands of a vindictive housewife? They'll bury this. They'll bury you." As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened again. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Detective Miller was a cop, rumpled, tired, blue-collar. The man who walked in now was something else entirely. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than the judge's car. He moved with a fluid, lethal grace. He was followed by 4 other men in identical suits, wearing earpieces. "Agent Graves," Alexander said, letting out a breath of relief. He straightened his jacket, trying to regain his composure. "Thank God. These local police are harassing me. Secure the scene. We need to move the assets to a secure server immediately." Agent Graves walked past the gallery, past the bailiff, and stopped in the center of the well. He looked at Alexander Sterling with eyes that were completely dead. "Mr. Sterling," Graves said. His voice was smooth, neutral, and terrifying. "Graves, listen," Alexander said, stepping forward. "She has a document, a solvency agreement. She claims ownership of the algorithm. You have to invoke the National Security Clause. Seize the IP. Don't let her take it. Graves turned his head slowly to look at Catherine. He studied her for a long moment. Then, he did something Alexander didn't expect. He nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Sterling," Graves said. "Or should I say, Miss Vane?" Catherine wiped her eyes. "Agent Graves. You know him?" Alexander asked, his voice rising in pitch. "We've been monitoring the Vane protocol for 20 years, Graves said, turning back to Alexander. "Did you really think we didn't know who wrote the patch in 2016? Did you really think we believed you were the genius behind the encryption updates?" Alexander Frosa. "We knew Silas," Graves said. "We tried to recruit him in the 90s. He refused. When he died, and your company suddenly rose from the ashes, we suspected. But the code worked, so we let it slide. Stability is more important than justice in my line of work." "Exactly," Alexander said. "So protect the stability. Keep me in charge." "But then came 2016, Graves continued, ignoring him. "The system crashed. You were panicking. We were watching the servers. We saw the login from the residential IP address. We saw the syntax change. We saw the elegance return to the code. We knew it wasn't you, Alexander. We knew someone else had the keys." Graves gestured to Catherine. "We did a background check on your wife back then. We found the birth certificate anomaly. We figured it out. We didn't intervene because she was stabilizing the asset. As long as she was in the picture, the code was safe." "But she's divorcing me," Alexander cried. "She's taking the company. She's a security risk." "On the contrary," Graves said coldly, "you are the risk, Mr. Sterling. You are unstable. You are facing a murder charge. And you just attempted to liquidate critical defense assets to a Cayman account during a recess. That is a violation of your contract with the Department of Defense." Alexander's phone buzzed. He looked down. "Notification. Transfer denied. Account frozen." "We froze your assets 5 minutes ago," Graves said. "The solvency agreement is valid, but more importantly, the betrayal clause aligns with our interests. We prefer the engineer over the salesman." Alexander looked around the room. The walls were closing in. Gavin Reed had quietly moved his chair 3 feet away from Alexander, distancing himself physically and legally. "You can't do this," Alexander whispered. "I am Sterling Dynamics." "No," Catherine said, stepping forward. She held the yellowed envelope in her hand like a verdict. "You were just the user interface, Xander, and you've been deprecated." Alexander Sterling was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a narcissist, and narcissists, when cornered, do not surrender. They try to burn the house down with everyone inside. "Fine," Alexander snarled, his face contorted into a mask of pure malice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black device. It wasn't a phone. It was a RSA security token, a hardware key generator. "Stop him," Detective Miller shouted, reaching for his weapon. "Don't," Alexander screamed, holding the token up like a grenade. "This is the master admin key. It generates a localized EMP burst command to the server farm in Jersey. One button, and I wipe the magnetic drives. I burn the algorithm. If I go down, the code goes down. The defense grid, the logistics, the banks, it all goes dark." The courtroom froze. Judge Harrison stood up behind the bench, his face pale. Agent Graves signaled his men to hold their fire. If Alexander pressed the button, the economic damage would be in the trillions. "Put it down, Alexander," Graves said, calmly. "No," Alexander laughed, a high, jagged sound. "You want the code? You can't have it. I built this empire. Me, not her, not Silas. Me." He looked at Catherine. "This is your fault, Cat. You should have just taken the condo. You should have just been the good little wife. Now look what you've made me do." Catherine didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the courtroom, an island of calm in the chaos. She looked at the device in his hand, then up at his eyes. "You really don't understand how it works, do you?" she asked, softly. "I know enough to destroy it," Alexander yelled. "You know what the manual tells you," Catherine said. "You know the surface level, but you never looked at the kernel, Xander. You were too busy buying yachts and taking credit. I'm pressing it, Alexander threatened, his thumb hovering over the red button. 3 seconds. 1. Go ahead, Catherine said. Gavin Reed gasped. Catherine, are you crazy? He'll wipe the assets. 2. Alexander's hand shook. Press it, Catherine challenged him. Do it. Alexander screamed and jammed his thumb down on the button. The device beeped. A red light flashed. Alexander looked at the ceiling, expecting the lights to flicker, expecting the phones to start ringing with news of a global crash. Nothing happened. The air conditioner hummed. The lights stayed on. Alexander pressed it again. And again. Beep, beep, beep. Why isn't it working? He whispered, hitting the device against the table. This is the admin key. It's hardwired. It was the admin key, Catherine said. She took a step closer to him, until 2016. When I rewrote the kernel, Xander, I didn't just fix the latency. I changed the hierarchy. She tapped her temple. The vein protocol is a living code. It learns. It recognizes patterns. And I taught it to recognize you. What are you talking about? Alexander breathed. I taught it to recognize greed, Catherine said. I taught it that any command coming from your specific admin credentials that threatened the integrity of the system was to be treated as a virus. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. It was a cheap, old model with a cracked screen. The system locked you out 10 minutes ago when you tried to transfer the money to the Caymans. You haven't been the admin for a long time, Xander. You've just been a guest user with a fancy title. Catherine tapped a single button on her screen. Suddenly, the large monitors on the walls of the courtroom, usually used for video evidence, flickered to life. A command prompt appeared, green text on a black background. It scrolled rapidly, thousands of lines of code. Then, the text stopped. A single message appeared in the center of the screens, large and unmistakable. Access granted. Welcome back, Kitty. System integrity, 100% user. Asterling deleted. Alexander dropped the black token. It clattered on the floor, useless plastic. He stared at the screen, seeing his own erasure. You locked me out of my own company, he whispered. No, Catherine corrected him. I locked you out of my company. The company you stole from a dead man. Detective Miller moved in. This time, there were no objections. He grabbed Alexander's wrists and slapped the handcuffs on. The metallic click-click echoed through the room, final and absolute. Alexander Sterling, Miller recited, you are under arrest for the murder of Silas Vane, wire fraud, and attempted destruction of federal property. Alexander didn't fight. He went limp. He looked at Catherine one last time as they dragged him away. His eyes were empty. He wasn't mourning his freedom. He was mourning his ego. He couldn't believe he had been beaten by the porcelain doll. Gavin Reed stood up, smoothing his suit. Your Honor, I would like to formally request to withdraw as counsel for the defendant, and, if the court pleases, I have some files regarding Mr. Sterling's offshore accounts that the prosecution might find interesting. Judge Harrison looked at Gavin with disgust. Sit down and shut up, Mr. Reed. You'll get your turn. The judge turned to Catherine. He looked at the woman who had walked in as a discarded wife and was standing now as a titan of industry. Mrs. Sterling, the judge said, then corrected himself. Miss Vane, regarding the divorce petition. Yes, Your Honor, I am granting the summary judgment based on the solvency agreement, Judge Harrison said, banging the gavel. The marriage is dissolved. The assets, including Sterling Dynamics and all intellectual property, are awarded to the plaintiff. Court is adjourned. The steps of the courthouse were different this time. When Catherine walked out, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Manhattan. The paparazzi were still there, but the mood had changed. They weren't shouting questions about infidelity or alimony anymore. They were silent, respectful, almost afraid. Word had leaked. The waitress was the architect. The victim was the victor. Agent Graves stood by a black SUV at the curb. He opened the back door for her. We'll need to debrief you, Miss Vane, Graves said. The Pentagon needs to know that the transition of power will be smooth. The transition is already done, Catherine said, pausing on the sidewalk. She looked up at the skyline, towards the gleaming glass tower of the Sterling Dynamics headquarters. The code is stable, and I'm not going to be a ghost anymore. What will you do? Graves asked. Will you sell? Sell? Catherine smiled. It was a genuine smile this time. Why would I sell my father's legacy? I'm going to finish what he started. Silas wanted to open source everything, Graves warned. We can't allow that. Silas wanted the world to be safe, Catherine said. We'll find a middle ground, Agent Graves. You get your logistics. But the encryption, the privacy tools, those belong to the people. No more backdoors. For the highest bidder. No more Alexanders. Graves considered this. He knew he couldn't force her. She held the keys. I suppose we can work with that. Catherine turned to walk to the car, but she stopped. She reached into her purse and pulled out the yellowed envelope, the solvency agreement. She looked at it for a moment. It was just paper. The real power had been in her head all along. She saw a trash can nearby. She walked over and dropped the envelope inside. Miss Vane? Graves asked. That's your proof of ownership. I don't need the paper, Catherine said, tapping her head. I am the source code. She got into the car. As the door closed, she didn't look back at the courthouse. She took out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in 10 years. Hello? A voice answered. It was the old patent clerk who had been her father's only friend. It's Kitty, Catherine said. I'm coming home, and I'm bringing the work with me. The car pulled away, merging into the traffic of the city she now owned. And that is how the porcelain doll shattered the glass ceiling and her husband's life with a single piece of paper. Alexander Sterling thought he was discarding a liability, but he was actually handing over the keys to the kingdom. It's a powerful reminder. Never underestimate the quiet ones. They're usually the ones observing, learning, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Catherine didn't just win a divorce. She vindicated her father and reclaimed her identity. If you enjoyed this story of justice, betrayal, and the ultimate comeback, please smash that like button. It helps the channel grow so we can bring you more incredible stories like this. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a drama. What do you think? Was Catherine's revenge too harsh? Or did Alexander get exactly what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.